Thanks very much, Jeff, and it's great to see such a big audience here for an important topic. I didn't choose the topic. The work. What I'm going to talk about is drawn heavily from the work of the Child and Youth Mortality Review Committee. Chairing this committee is both a pleasure and a torment. We review the lives and deaths of the children and young people in New Zealand between the 28th day of life and their 25th birthday, and we review those deaths in detail. We owe it to those children to learn from their passing and change things. So I'm going to take this opportunity to share my torment with you in terms of how can we do things differently. So this really gives you an overview of the deaths that we review in this country, and you'll see in the first year of life a large toll of deaths, and about 60 of those deaths are sudden infant deaths, that sudden unexpected death in infancy that Russell's already referred to, and those 60 deaths are largely preventable. We have in this older age group about 200 deaths per year of young people, mostly related to risk-taking behaviour, and again, they're preventable. If you think about those 200 deaths a year, that means 4 young people need to die, often at a weekend, every week, to keep that total running. That observation led us to look at alcohol-related harm in the 15 to 24s. And last year we published a study which showed that 32% of injury deaths in that age group are attributable to, as in directly caused by, or alcohol was a contributing factor. And that special report is available on our website. The challenge that I've been given for this talk is not to talk about that group. And as Jenny's already referred to, our data for the younger age group is scanty. Just one thing that, for me, one of the highlights of that report was the observation that younger men and women overall die because of others drinking, not their own. And that's typically on the roads. And it's only the older males, that's over the age of 20, that are dying because of their own drinking. So it's a very important take-home message, particularly for young people and their parents. So in the absence of really hard data, what I'm going to try and do is just give you some typical examples of the sorts of cases that we review. These are not real cases. We've got very tight legislation that forces us to maintain confidentiality, and any resemblance is really a coincidence. But these sorts of deaths are common. So when considering deaths in the first year of life, we have this important concept that every sleep should be a safe sleep. Imagine a busy household, 2 families, limited space, mattresses on the floor, other things on the floor, clothes, toys, a difficult environment to live in because of the overcrowding. Shift workers is often a common factor for many of these families trying to make a living. Adults and toddlers often sleep on the couch, and importantly, no regular place for the baby to sleep. Friday night, social gathering, friends around, another person in the household. Not uncommon in that setting for a baby to end up sleeping on a couch. A couch is a very dangerous place for a baby. It takes not much pressure under their chin to block their airway. Couches are soft, babies can slip into the cracks. It takes very little pressure on the chest of a baby to stop them breathing. And babies in the first year die very quietly from suffocation, especially if they've smoked before they were born. In this scenario, mum wakes in the morning, realises the baby's not fed all night, can't find the baby. There's no regular routine. And this is a theme story in many of the deaths that we review, that people don't know where to look for the baby when they don't wake. Finally, the baby is found, cold and stiff on the couch, between the cushions where mum had slept. Mum's absolutely distraught. She had no intention to kill her baby. She can't remember what happened, or why the baby was asleep on the couch. And the only mention we get to about alcohol in this sort of case is the police report to the coroner commenting about empty bottles around the house. Almost never, in fact probably true to say, never would blood samples be taken from those involved in this sort of death. So how important is death by these sudden unexpected deaths in infancy? If you look at deaths in the first year, it's an enormous part of the pie. That's the 60 deaths. We've done a brilliant job with reducing so many of these other deaths. There is a hidden good news story in that we used to lose 200 babies a year from this, but 60 a year is still far too many, and this is something that's largely disappeared off our nation's radar. We hear an awful lot about the 1.8% of deaths that are due to assault. We hear very little about this group. So what's going on? It's relatively simple. We have a group of infants under 1 who die without enough distress to alert their caregivers. That's really from the perception of the parents. There was nothing the baby could do to tell parents to be worried. And with an environment typically in which it was harder to breathe, the babies suffocate. For some babies, and that's probably somewhere in the region of 20 babies a year, we have another 20 babies a year where, sure, the environment for breathing was not great, but there were other vulnerabilities in the baby. But if they'd slept safely, they probably wouldn't have died. And a small number at the other end, which are much harder to prevent. New Zealand has very poor data at present on the level of alcohol involvement in these sorts of deaths. A UK study showed that for 25% of cases of sudden infant death, the mum had used alcohol in the last 24 hours. For a control group, only about 3%. My gut feeling is that we've got a greater percentage than that 25%, and some studies have suggested up to 50%. The key action point is to reprioritise safe sleep spaces for babies. At no time in the past did as many babies die as projectiles unrestrained in cars as are currently dying in unsafe sleep spaces. So it's just as important as car seats. And we have some exciting innovations in New Zealand with Waikora and Peppy Pods as options for families so that the baby has got a safe place to sleep. Change of pace. Safety in numbers, question mark. Imagine beautiful, typical New Zealand river, warm, sunny afternoon, extended family gathering, plenty of food, plenty of alcohol, kids playing together, happily moving from pond to pool, from pool to pond. As you'd imagine, all getting wet, getting very noisy, very happy setting. Adults just settling down for a quiet afternoon, and then someone asks the question, where's the 4-year-old? Bush and scrub around the riverbanks, pools of quiet water. Safety in numbers it isn't. After a quick search, 4-year-old found face down, floating under the water in a calm pool. Attempts at resuscitation were unsuccessful. Group supervision is actually not a good thing, especially by groups of children. If we consider the drowning statistics for New Zealand, we get what I think of as almost a butterfly wing effect. And this is an important message that in those first years of life, children are almost completely dependent on intense supervision by others for their safety. So really under 5, that's their major protection, and you'll see it lets children down. And then we have our risk-taking group who also start to drown more. And that's not about swimming less well, this is about doing dangerous things with water. And alcohol is a contributor to a proportion of those deaths. As children grow older, they drown further from home. So in the 0 to 4s, private pools, baths, this is about intense supervision, and fenced pools where the fences are maintained. As they get a little bit older, 5 to 14, we start to see an increasing toll of river drownings and a much smaller toll there. So really around injury prevention, important message in the under 5s, home is a key place to work. So important take-home message is children drown very quietly and very quickly. In the films and the movies, they come up to the surface and struggle and thrash. In reality, they slide quietly under the water, and that's the last that's heard of them. So inadequate supervision is a major factor in drowning under fives, and that's about direct line of sight by an adult who of course needs to be sober. And that group supervision is a hazard not just for drowning. We've noted in some recent work on driveway runovers that it's quite commonly considered that the children are safe because they're in a group, but one of the children is still run over by a car in a driveway. Looking at New Zealand Water Safety Council figures, we see for all age groups, they have data on about 20 or more deaths per year with alcohol as a contributing factor. But we don't have, as Jenny was saying, our systems for collecting information on supervisory failure are just not good. Other aspects of supervisory failure, I've mentioned already, the driveway runovers. Falls in the home are a major factor. Safety is around adult supervision, intense adult supervision. Burns and scalds. For that 10-kilo child that's just beginning to start crawling around the house, the coffee cup, the kettle cord is an extremely dangerous item. House fires. We do have recorded a number of house fires where alcohol in caregivers was a factor. And of course, you've got to have a fire alarm, but you've got to have someone who can respond to the fire alarm. That means they've got to be awake, they've got to be rousable. So every child needs a sober caregiver. Remembering little children can drown in very small volumes of water. So this is about competent parents who notice the risks, notice when the child's got a problem. And fortunately, we see very few deaths for children between the ages of 0 and 15 from poisoning. But poisoning is a major contributor to hospitalizations in this age group. And again, this is about supervision from competent adults. Now, I've talked a lot about death, because that's what we do review as a Child and Youth Mortality Review Committee. But just remember that deaths are only the very tip of an iceberg, and for every death, there is that enormous level of injury and permanent harm that happens, which is even harder to count than the deaths. So the pattern of injury really we're seeing is that 0 to 5's home environment safety is crucial, but with total dependence on an adult. And then, in some ways, 5 to 14, there is reasonable safety that these kids have got. Mostly very supportive parents still around, and their own innate skills are increasing, particularly around things like water. So we see relatively few deaths. But environmental safety has to be considered to that wider degree. And these are key years to build the competence for the risk years ahead. If you remember that first graph of that blip with the 200 people who die subsequently, they need to learn the skills and learn that risk competence in these years. So what issues come out of those stories? So every child needs a sober caregiver. We need to keep focusing in our community of a broader understanding of the risks of alcohol and hazardous environments. And remember, the home is a hazardous environment. People think of the home as somewhere where there aren't hazards, but we have driveway hazards, cars, lethal force around children's homes, and then 40 babies suffocating in their place of sleep per year. And in our report to the Minister of Health last year, we made that recommendation that police should be mandated to test for alcohol-related impairment whenever a child or young person suffers serious injury or fatality, regardless of location. It's bizarre that if a child is run over 6 feet in front of their driveway, the police will always check the driver for alcohol. If they are run over 6 feet within their driveway, they will almost never be checked for alcohol. And you extend that further, and that's because that's the law. So, Sue, born to a young mum, alcohol-related conception, alcohol during pregnancy we've already heard about, exposed to an environment where there's mum and partner frequently drunk, experiencing domestic violence, removed from the household for a period of 18 months because of query might have been shaken. Very hard to confirm exactly what was going on. Subsequent years, school failure, noted to have poor attention, low achievement, beginning in the sort of 8, 9, 10 age group, violent outbursts, taking some time off school at 9, stood down by 11. What next? Early use of sweet alcoholic drinks, alcopops, increasingly alienated from community, disconnected, getting known better by the police, but many other people not actually knowing this young person, really quite disconnected from all of those support services that should be there. Alcohol poisoning, seen unconscious in the bushes as a paediatrician, that sort of story is relatively common. We have a lot of young people, even under the 15s, who do come in unconscious. You always worry about the context of that and try and wrap around a package after them. This sort of life typically leads to an unplanned teenage pregnancy. And what next? These stories are incredibly familiar to us within Child and Youth Mortality Review in terms of this person will become known to us because of suicide, will become known to us because of they become a violent offender and they may assault someone else who dies, or they die of their own risk-taking behaviour on the roads. Or this may well have been the mother of the baby who started with the first case, suffocating her baby under her arm while sleeping on the sofa after binge drinking. So we could say that this is a life that's been sort of spoiled by being marinated in alcohol, a bit like marinating a steak in kerosene, completely altered, changed forever, to a point which it is very hard to be salvaged. We'll talk later about alcohol exposure before birth, so I won't mention that now, but those impacts of witnessed and learned behaviours. We all know the importance of talking to our children, and how if a child is talked to, they talk back. If you smile at a child, they learn to smile back. If you don't do those things, and they don't have that loving contact, they don't know how to have loving contact. Permanently scarred, permanently altered. So the impacts of less supervision, less attention, resources may be sparse because of parental drinking, poor connections, and their exposure to drinking, fear, violence. That the effect of a baby being raised in an environment of fear is also extremely scarring. So how do we break the cycle? And I think this should be the focus of some of what's discussed this afternoon. Where are the intervention points? How do we put in place that unbroken chain of support? And in the Child and Youth Mortality Review submission to the Green Paper, we made a lot of comments around making children visible in the services that their parents access. That's about mental health services, drug and alcohol services, correction services, probation services. Actually, the children are potentially going to be the victims. We need to be putting the resources into the children as well as the parents. But so many services focus on the problem in hand, not the bigger picture. Now, no talk on alcohol-related harm and injury could forget the transport stuff. So really, this is just to show that injury matters. Transport injury is a big problem. This is the older age group of 5 to 9s. We talk a lot about the tragedy of cancer. These days, cancer is actually survivable in childhood. We've got some incredibly good statistics for cancer. Yet, we've still got 24%, quarter of our deaths related to transport injury. 10 to 14, picture hasn't really changed. Unintentional injury is still a major focus in transport-related injury. So, transport deaths, biggest killer, 5 to 14. That's the sort of the skull of a child who's been a projectile on a car. Major cost. I didn't mention earlier that we do know some of the data for the 14 to 25s, about $400 million per year spent as direct health costs by ACC for risk-taking behaviour-related harm. That's a lot of money. We invest heavily in transport-related efforts, and alcohol is a major issue. And these are so-called injury pyramids, and it's just interesting again to focus on the fact that the number of deaths may be relatively small, but underneath that there is an enormous burden of injury as well. So this is a slide taken from a paper the police have published fairly recently around the fact that 18% of the police budget is being spent on alcohol-related problems. And then if you look at the detail of that in terms of violence, traffic crashes, family violence, and begin to see that through the eyes of a child, that is an enormous problem. And where do we invest the input? Do we invest in the reaction to the problem, or do we invest in preventing it? So, in summary, the real size of this problem is unknown, but we knew a few things. Every child needs a sober caregiver. We need a broader understanding of some of those risks related to alcohol. We should be valuing our children in the same way that we value our roads and motor vehicles in terms of testing for alcohol whenever a child or young person suffers serious injury or fatality. And alcohol control and harm minimisation is important for infants and children. They have only that one opportunity to develop and grow to their full potential. We have a duty as a community, as a society, to make sure that opportunity can be used and make children visible in the services for their parents. This is just the start of the ideas. I think there's an awful lot more, and I'm looking forward to this afternoon where we can discuss that. So I'd like to acknowledge a lot of people involved in this, that the Child and Youth Mortality Review Group is in fact a very large machine with organisational elements in every district health board in the country, 500 agents around the country with strong commitment from police and others, as well as coroners and others. Thank you.